Hello everyone, this is Toasty3, and today I'm going to go over all of the CS and math classes I took in my freshman year. So let's start with fall 2021. So in both semesters, I actually went to UIUC and then transferred to Georgia Tech after my first year. So in fall 2021, I took one CS class and one math class. CS 124 and Math 241 honors. So let's start with CS 124. So this was the first CS class I took, where I actually enjoyed what I was doing. With every CS class I took before this one in high school, AP Comp Sci Principles in 10th grade, Python and Art of Problem Solving, and a tutor that helped me with HackerRank, I found myself not really caring about what we were doing, and I felt like the only reason I was writing code was to finish assignments. So if I felt like that during CS 124, I felt like I would have done much worse in it. But this class introduced me to a lot of interesting CS concepts and also was fairly intense because we had daily homework, and these would usually contain one coding problem to solve. And also every week we would have a proctored quiz online. And because this class was right after my English class, I had to go all the way to my dorm and set up the Zoom meeting to set up the quiz. And sometimes these quizzes would be a bit annoying. They would test some pretty specific details. But I still managed to get an A in the class because, the quizzes weren't like impossible, and the rest of them, the rest of the assignments were all like graded coding, so which was based on completion and passing test cases. So this was a pretty fun class and probably my favorite of fall 21. So next up is Math 241. So this class was definitely much harder. In high school, I did competition math, but even despite that, I found this class to be pretty intense for me. I took the honors version of it, so that also made things more difficult. So the exams were worth a lot more than the other assignments, which is a pattern that we'll see in these college classes. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to do well on the second and third ones. This was the first time that I got 81, 85 on like math exams. And that really took me aback, despite doing well on the first one with the 94. Also, the honors homework assignments, so there's both regular and honors. The honors ones had a few questions that took kind of a while to solve, and I wouldn't always do well on them. But the lectures were really interesting because the professor cared about the material, and I also liked this class a lot, and it felt very rewarding. The final exam gave one of the most stressful times of college, where the solutions came out, and I realized I messed up a lot more than I thought I did. But still, it was graded just leniently enough where I could earn a 94 in the class, where the cutoff for an A is, I'm guessing, a 93. Maybe curved, but I'm not sure. So those were my two classes of fall 21. So now let's talk about spring 2022, where I took two CS classes and two math classes. So let's start with, let's go in order again. So starting with CS 128. So this was kind of like CS 124, where you had to put in the effort needed to get the grade you wanted. But the hardest part of this course was the machine problems. CS 124 had a machine problem that was multi part, had split into multiple deadlines. But this one, CS 128, had one MP almost every week, and each one of them required hours upon hours of work. That being said, the feeling of finally finishing one was really satisfying. Labs were basically mini MPs and were usually nowhere near as intense as the MPs, except for Lab 7 for some reason. And in general, getting a good grade in the class was about being able to endure somewhat demanding MPs. And that was prioritized over getting things right versus wrong, like in other classes. There were also weekly quizzes, but they were not proctored. I don't remember if they were also timed, but some of them weren't even about coding. They were open note, and that's all I can really remember. But they were far from the worst part. They're also daily lessons, just like CS124, with a bunch of graded problems, coding problems. And just like 124, there was no final exam. Okay, next up is 173. This is a very hit or miss class. A lot of people I know complained about it being tricky and difficult. And honestly, a lot of the problems seem designed to trick you, especially on the homework. And honestly, on the homework, I also fell for a lot of these tricks. And sometimes I would get a low score because I was just not paying enough attention. But the participation grade and the study problems were 300s. And then comes the main part of the class, which were the examlets, which is what they called weekly quizzes, where we had to go all the way to a testing center to take these quizzes that were proctored. And thankfully, they were usually a lot less tricky than the homework, but they still kind of were tricky sometimes. I lucked out though. This was one of my strongest performances, where I got 100 on all of the first 10 quizzes and then 93 on the last one. So, yeah, the examlets were worth 80% of the grade, so it really depends on how well you do on this course, on these examlets. The good news is a lot of the previous examlets are online, so you can refer to those. I personally didn't mind this course. I think I just find this kind of content to be more up my alley. So that's probably why I didn't find this to be too bad. So next up is Math 347. This is intended to be a bridge between the 200s and the 400s, where we're introduced to proofs and other higher level things like analysis. So, yeah, honestly, I wasn't a fan of this class, other than the lectures and the professor they were very entertaining and had a lot of jokes during the lectures that were kept my attention most of the time. But what I didn't like about the class, well, let's start with the exams. They're set up to emphasize recollection and memorization of concepts and proofs we covered, and we didn't have much freedom in solutions. But worse than the exams were the homework. Although I managed to get these done in time, the grading was really just not good, in my opinion. It was really inconsistent as well. Sometimes the grading was really generous and they would miss things that I knew I messed up on. Other times they just like took off points because I would do something that they just didn't align with what they had, I guess. So I lost points for that. And there are other times when they just didn't provide any explanation for why they took off any points. So it was pretty frustrating every time I got a homework returned. And that made it pretty upsetting. And the final exam was intentionally made super difficult. And I was worried that I was going to get like a B plus or something in this class. But then the professor curved the overall course grade so hard that a 70 was the cutoff for an A, 85 was the cutoff for an A plus, and anything below 70 was an A minus. So I guess it worked out, but it was kind of frustrating how they graded the homeworks, and that was my biggest issue with the class, and just didn't like it. And similar thing for Math 461, another class where I wasn't a fan. The early material was similar to like math counting problems, but then the later material was more into probability distributions and stuff that was new to me. There was nearly weekly homework that was mostly computational and wasn't too long. The first exam was pretty easy, but then second exam was actually quite difficult, which is pretty common for these math classes. So all this was on pace for getting an A, but then the final exam happened, and after going through some really hard final exams this semester, this was my last one, and I just like intentionally threw at the end. Like as soon as I got the first thing wrong, I just chose to, and it was also live graded. Um, I just kept screwing up, and it just like I just didn't want to keep going. So I just threw the final exam on purpose, and I distinctly remember being like the third lowest score in the class on the final. And I literally just went from an A to a B plus with this one intentional throw. And finally, there were 6 quizzes. They didn't pose any issues. So, yeah, but the main issue was that I just threw the final exam. I had a chance for an A, and the final exam was easy too, and I still decided to throw it for no reason. Okay, well, that's all of my CS and math classes for my freshman year. I didn't take any in the summer because I dropped the ones I did. And so, yeah, so tune in next time for my second year ones where I begin my journey through Georgia Tech.